The question of reparations for Black Americans, foundational Black Americans, those who can trace our lineage back to the plantations and tobacco farms and cotton plantations of North America, it has been a hotly contested issue. It's been a hotly contested question. Who's going to pay? Who's owed reparations? How they're supposed to, how the victims and the people who are descended from the enslaved people are supposed to get them. So nobody has ever actually, in my opinion, done enough work to figure out who's at fault and who's the liable parties. I think the easy fix that doesn't require much work is to look around and say, oh, it's the white people. But then you also have to consider the fact that there were a lot of black people who participated in the enslavement of black people, not just in the United States, but also in Africa. The other thing you have to consider is that the defendants are so numerous. How would you ever sue them? And we're talking about literally millions of people with different, whether they be natural citizens or juridical citizens, whether they exist now, whether they have successors. It's nearly an impossible task. Some people say, well, let's just sue the federal government. And, I'm just going to tell you guys that's probably not going to happen, largely because there's immunity allotted to the federal government. So you're going to use the system to sue the system. And that's really just something that's quite impossible. Yeah, the federal government can give you permission to sue it, but then you still need an act of Congress to approve whatever settlement. And so you write back to Congress. And so what I've done to just truncate the issue and just fast forward this is I've developed basically a draft of what I think would be a very good piece of legislation if it could be enacted. And I've entitled it, and this is a working title, Foundational Black American Slave Trade Redress Act. Now, this term, foundational Black American, or the term foundational, because we all know what Black American is. That denotes those people who can trace their heritage back to the enslavement here in North America. But I like the term foundational because it's not so great of a variant from Black American. In other words, we're Black American, we've gotten used to that term. Let's just add foundational Black American onto it to further distinguish ourselves, as opposed to changing the name to something else. We went from colored to Negro to Black American, African American, and even though Black American and African American are used interchangeably, most people know what that is. However, since the 1980s, we've had lots of people from Africa who are also American coming to the continent. So the question is, how do we distinguish ourselves between Africans from Africa who come to the United States and Black Americans or African Americans? And so I think this term foundational Black American is a good term. I have listened to gentleman, brother Tariq Nasheed, speak on this many times, and it's become very popular over the past decade or so, and I think it fits. Nevertheless, I want to read the title. I want to read this, and I want to explain it to you because it has a tendency to answer all the questions. Now, of course, this would be something that would have to pass through the House of Representatives and also the Senate of the United States and be ratified by the president, which I think once I finish is not going to be difficult to do. Now, I'm going to read it, and as I go along, I'll explain why I put certain quotes in there. So again, the name of this is and you can look at this, if you want to look at this, you can find it on my Dennis Sperling podcast YouTube page in the community section, and it reads as follows. This act may be cited as the Foundational Black American Slave Trade Act of 2024, or whatever year it is. The findings, Section 2, the findings and purpose. Findings, Congress recognizes that the illegal transatlantic slave trade, including notable incidents involving the slave ships Clotilda and the Wanderer, resulted in the forced and unlawful transportation of many Africans directly to the United States. This trade has left a lasting impact on their descendants, known as foundational Black Americans. Okay, so I mentioned the term Clotilda. I mentioned the term wanderer. These were names of slave ships that arrived to the shores of the United States after slavery, after the international slave trade ban went into place in 1807. So what does that mean? That means on the law, under American law, under the law of the United States, the act of transporting them from the United States to the from the west coast of Africa or wherever they were, whether west coast, east coast, whatever, because actually the Wanderer was a ship that originated in the Congo. So the slavers went to the Congo, picked up Africans, and brought them here. So long after slavery, the international slave trade became illegal, there were still those who were bringing slaves to this country. That is a very easily to prove fact and a very complicated case. See, the problem you're going to run into is that at the time, or let me give you some dates. America basically was formed in 1776. Before that, it was a British colony. So how do you sue Great Britain for an act that was legal? How do you sue America for something that Great Britain did? You could do it, but since both of those entities actually still exist, you would sue Great Britain for what happened in its colony before 1776. But again, slavery was legal at that time. In fact, slavery was legal in Africa, and it still is legal in Africa. So how can you hold Great Britain responsible for something that the African kings and kingdoms and countries that the nations were doing? But still, keep that in mind, 1776. By 1887 or 1888, the international slave trade became illegal. Now, that law went into effect 20 years later in 1807. So I meant to say 1778. Apologies. So from 1776, America formed. And so now in 1788, which is about 11 years later, slavery, the international importation of Africans from Africa was deemed illegal. Okay? And so this law went into place 20 years later in 1807. So the question you have to ask yourself, well, how long was the importation of Africans to this country as slaves legal? Well, 11 years. After that, it was illegal. Yeah, it had a grace period of about 20 more years. So we're talking about a total of 31 years that the importation of Africans to the United States, the illegal catching and bringing them here, was illegal. So for 31 years, it was actually illegal to bring them here. But the law went into place in 1807 or 1808. So now from 1808 to 1860, you had a time period where Africans were still being brought to the United States. They were still being brought, and it was done illegally. That is a clear violation of law. That is something that if you're a participant in that, then you owe the victims of your crime restitution, whether it be the person who sold them or the person who purchased them illegally. And so when we talk about the Clotilda and we talk about the Wanderer, these two incidents took place in 1860 and I believe 1859, 1860 at the time. The transatlantic importation, illegal transatlantic slave trade was illegal. At that point, it was legal. So we have a clear, definitive line where these actions were deemed criminal. Okay. Nevertheless, as a result of these criminal acts, wherein Africans were brought from Benin, as far as the Clotilda, into Alabama, and from the Congo to Georgia, as far as the Wanderer is concerned, these were clearly illegal acts. So this specifically addressed that. Now, what do we do? And that's a good defining line. Number one, you define the class of people that were affected. Africans brought to this country after 1808 when slavery was deemed illegal. That is a clear defining line. Now, I know some of you are saying, well, what about all the black people before that? What about all the black people who were enslaved in Africa? Look, you can eat an elephant a little bit at a time. We're trying to take a bite out of this. We're trying to get a foothold in it. This is a clear, decisive line. It's something that can be redressed. It's something that can be defined. At no point in history has there ever been a world without slavery, period. And I'm just going to talk to you and give you the facts. So we start, every country starts suing every other country, every other citizen for slavery, you're going to have a problem. Because slavery was illegal. Slavery was legal in the United States. It was legal in Great Britain. It was legal in many nations and countries in Africa. And some of you said it was a different kind of slavery. You know what? Jail is jail is jail. Whether you in the Club Fed or whether you in the Rikers Island somewhere, it's still prison. It's still jail. Slavery is still slavery. You can have degrees of slavery. You can argue about who had the nicest master. But bottom line, it was still slavery. It's still defined as slavery, period. Whether you had slavery with benefits versus slavery with less benefits. The bottom line is slavery. And by title, that's what it was. So you can't have one country sue another country for what it was done when it was doing the same thing, period. Okay? So nevertheless, and if you are going to address it, let that be for somebody else. What I'm talking about is the Africans who were captured after slavery, captured in Africa and brought to the United States after 1808, when the importation of slaves, black people from Africa, became legal. That's what we're talking about. And that's what this defines. Now, the purpose of this act, what is it designed to do? This act is designed to enable foundational black Americans, again, we use that term, foundational black Americans, specifically those who are direct descendants of Africans forcibly transported to the United States after the 1808 federal prohibition of the slave trade, including but not limited to the descendants from the Clotilda and the Wanderer incidents, to seek reparations from the modern African nations and are successors to those historical entities that participated in the slave trade. So here's the thing. I want you all to listen to me. There are a lot of people, if the reparations line opens, there are a lot of people from the Caribbean, South America, Central America, and Africa, and white people, and Asians, and Indians who are going to line up and say, I'm owed reparations too. Why? I've had to suffer racism. Well, that's not what this is about. I've had to suffer degradation. That's not what this is about. Okay? Well, my people were brought to Jamaica illegally. Well, that's not, you need to go talk to the people who brought your people to Jamaica. But this is for our foundational black Americans, number one, who can trace their heritage or lineage back to the descendants of the Africans who were brought to the United States against federal law, and who were brought in on the Clotilda and the Wanderer. That is a ship that ended up in Alabama. They got a little place called Africatown where many of them stood. There's a fellow named Cudjo Lewis who has a documentary on, they talked about the Clotilda on Netflix. And then the Wanderer is something that's very, very seldom talked about, but that's another ship. Okay, so what have we done? We've eliminated these people, these hangers-ons, these opportunists who would just come along and try to get money just because they can get money. We've eliminated the Africans. We've eliminated the Caribbeans. We've eliminated the white folk, Asian folk, Native American, anybody else. This is solely for foundational black Americans who can trace their roots back to the people of the Clotilda and the Wanderer, or any other ship that was brought from Africa to the United States, okay, illegally after 1808. Now, what we did is we just eliminated all that. If I'm looking at this as a congressman, I'm like, okay, this is manageable. This is not something This is something that it definitely redresses an issue. The wrongdoers, what they did at the time was wrong. And who are we going after? And this is the controversial part. We are going after, seek reparations from the modern African nations that are successors to those historical entities that participated in the slave trade. So there are a lot of you who are saying the nations that were there then didn't exist. The king of the Congo, the king of Benin, they're not there. Yeah, but the land is there. The resources are there. The people are there. The descendants are there. It's still, for all intents and purposes, the same locus. Okay? Basic contract law says that if you take over a entity, whether it be natural or juridical, whether it be an LLC or INC, if you take it over, yes, you receive and you inherit the assets of that corporation. But you also inherit the obligations of that corporation. Case in point, a lot of you all will say, well, America owes you money for slavery. And we talked about this earlier. Y'all didn't get it. Well, America didn't form till 1776. Slavery started in when? 16 what? When did it start? 1619. So from 1619 to 1776, that's when the bulk of the slavery took place. But you want to sue America. Why? Because you said, well, it inherited the land from UK. Okay. Well, at that time, the UK was a kingdom, and America wasn't even the same country. We fought to have freedom and separation from the King of England. But you want these people who fought against the English crown to inherit the debt, even though they took it by force. By contrast, Benin, which had a king, is still called Benin. Okay? And it's still the same people there. So if you don't want to get, if you want America to play, then certainly you want Benin to play, because there's a closer nexus between who had it and who has it now. Nevertheless, basic contracts law says you inherit the debts and the obligations of your predecessor. So in this regard, we have a law in the books that says this is American law. It's legal. It's basic tenets of law. It's something that's been deemed to be constitutional under corporations law, contract law, whatever. It's all. So this is not something that is unconstitutional under the United States Constitution. It is not a violation of due process or any of those tenets of law that we hold fast to. And so this is a sound piece of legislation, in that if we force the successor to be responsible for his predecessor's actions, that is good law. That is a sound principle of law that any judge can hang his robe on. And so that's what we're trying to do. Nevertheless, of course, I can understand why African nations wouldn't like that, because it's going to hold you responsible. Some of you say, well, we don't have any money. So you have something of value over there. That's why you have so many European countries over there exploiting you. You have oil, you have resources, you have land, you have wood, you have minerals, you got gas, you got everything. And but for you removing us forcibly and selling us to the European enslavers who are waiting on the coast, we would have that land too, and we would participate in the wealth of that land. But because you sold us for profit illegally at a time when the international slave trade was illegal, you owe us restitution, because you committed an illegal act through your, at that time, leader, the president of the king of Benin, and also the king of the Congo, with his blessing for his benefit. You owe us restitution. It was a criminal act. And so that's what's codified here. Okay? Again, if you want to see this, go to my community tab, go to the Dennis Sperling podcast and check it out. Now, section 3, and I know this is a little bit long, but I want you guys to hang in there, and I'll try to move a little faster. Foundational Black American, an individual. Who is this? So we want to define it under the definition section. Any good piece of legislation wants to be defined. What is a foundational Black American? An individual who is a direct descendant of an African person enslaved and transported directly from Africa to the United States post 1808, including those whose ancestors were victims of the Clotilda and Wanderer slave ship incidents. Now, of course, we understand that foundational Black American is a little broader than that, is those, and not just those who brought here after 1808, but also those who were brought from Africa beforehand. But the bottom line is this, for the purposes of this piece of legislation, this works because what it does is it narrows those who potentially have standing. Next up, another definition. I'm defining in Section 3, African sovereign. What is that? It refers to any current African nation that is a successor to a historical empire, kingdom, or entity that actively participated in the transatlantic slave trade. You guys know from that movie, The Woman King, that the the country of Dahomey, the king there participated in slavery. And that is where current the country of Benin is. The Congo actively participated. And so if you can prove that they participated in the slave trade after 1808, then that's a potential defendant, and that's it, okay? So it presents foundational Black Americans with an opportunity who can show that their family members were kidnapped at the behest and with the knowledge and the blessing and to the financial benefit of these kings and kingdoms, that their predecessors, the predecessors of the now countries of Congo and Benin, and I'm sure there's some other ones up in there that when we start doing the research, then you have a right of action to sue them. Establish jurisdiction. So again, we are basing this legislation on tenets of law that are well worn of the United States Constitution. Federal jurisdiction. How do we establish that? Under Section 4, federal jurisdiction, U.S. federal courts shall have exclusive jurisdiction over any civil action brought by a foundational Black American against an African sovereign for the acts related to illegal transatlantic slave trade. What that means? It means you sue them in federal court. If you want to sue them, you sue them in federal court. Where? Venue of the actions. Actions under the act shall be brought in the U.S. federal court that meets any of the following criteria. Location of plaintiffs, the district where the majority of the plaintiffs reside, to facilitate access and minimize the logistical burden for them. So in the case of the Clotilda, I believe that's in Mobile, Alabama. So that's going to be in the, I believe, the northern district of the United States, northern district of Alabama. So that's where the lawsuit will be brought against the country of Benin. You sue, and how do you sue? You sue them like you sue any other defendant. You file a lawsuit and you serve them. Defendant's presence, the district where the defendant, or here's another location, the district where the defendant, African sovereign, maintains a diplomatic, consular, or any official presence such as an embassy or consulate. So if the country of Benin has a consulate here in the United States, let's say they have one in New York or D.C., you can sue them in D.C. also. So not only do you sue them in the locus where the vast majority of the plaintiffs would live, but you can also sue them in the locus where their courthouse, the locus where their embassy is. Okay. Now, historical connection. The district that has significant historical connections to the transatlantic slave trade, events of specific slave trade incidents mentioned in the claim provide that this connection is material to the cause of action. This is just a general catch-all clause. For instance, if we're talking about the Wanderer, where the people ended up in South Georgia, you would sue them in the district court that encompasses that South Georgia region, maybe Savannah or something like that, whatever the United States District Court is over there, okay? So it gives you, so now we've established why we're suing, who can get sued. We've established the definition for both the plaintiffs and the defendants. We've established jurisdiction and venue. So all these questions are answered. Now, what are the exceptions? Okay, the exceptions to sovereign immunity. Human right, and this is Section 6. Sovereign immunity shall not apply to cases involving allegations of participation in the transatlantic slave trade by African sovereigns or their predecessors, entities, including specific cases such as the Clotilda or Wanderer incidents. So basically what this is saying is, well, let me say it like this. Typically, a sovereign nation who is sued in the United States can say, well, I have sovereign immunity because I'm an independent nation. You can't sue me. I'm Mexico. You can't sue me. I'm Canada. But by the sheer stroke of a pen and a legislative act, all that goes away because this is America. This is the United States. And for the most part, we can do what we want to do here. And the reason they can't get around that is because if they do business with the United States, i.e. oil refinement, diamond processing, whatever it is, gas, minerals, whatever it is, that means that you have valuable things here. And so if we're able to get a judgment, then we can go collect that judgment in the form of monetary compensation by taking your things and selling them to enact that judgment. You see? So even if they do try to plead sovereign immunity, this act already says, this proposed act already said, nope, you don't get that. Next up, successor state liability. The act recognizes African nations as liable for the actions of their predecessors, states concerning their involvement in transatlantic slave trade. Some of you are saying, again, and I'm going to address this question, how can you sue a nation that no longer exists? Because their successor is right there. Just like IBM and some of these other companies were taken over by some new companies. Oh, well, your successor is there. We'll sue your successor. Yeah, you might not exist anymore, but that's perfectly okay. We're going to sue you. It's the same thing that we do in environmental law. If you have someone who leaves some toxic waste on a piece of land and they move, oh, well, not only are we going to sue the current landowner, we're going to sue the people who owned it beforehand. And that is written into the law. You don't have to like it, but that's the law of the land. And if you avail yourself of the laws of the United States, then you're bound by the laws of the United States. And the great thing about it is the Constitution of the United States and these laws and laws like them have been interpreted and they've been deemed constitutional. So these are sound laws. Some of you are saying, well, it happened so long ago. Section 7 addresses that, statute of limitations. Extended limitations period. What does that mean? The statute of limitations is the time in which you have to file a lawsuit against someone when you feel when you are an aggrieved party. Now, some of you are saying, well, the Clotilda incident happened back in 1860. That's, what is that, like almost 200 years ago now? 100 and some years ago? Over 100? Oh, my God. Well, extended limitations period. Any claim under this act may be brought within 50 years of the enactment of this act, recognizing the enduring impact and historical injustices of address. So what does that mean? From the moment the president signs this act into law, you have 50 years to do your research, figure out whether or not you're descended from one of the Clotilda Africans or the Wanderer Africans or some other African who was brought here after 1808, and you can file suit against the African nation who facilitated that transport. And you can get a positive judgment against them. And then what are the remedies that you get? Okay, so you get 50 years, and this too is not illegal. This too is constitutional. Right now in New York City, they have a Survivors Act. They extended the statute of limitations for like 3 or 4 years for incidents that happened up to 40 years ago. And the same thing happened in California, same thing happened in Pennsylvania. That's how so many of these people are getting sued, whether it be P. Diddy, Bill Cosby, you name them. So you can do that. You can basically backdate your statute of limitations. And it's all legal because this is a sound tenet of American law. Now, what are the remedies? For some reason, a lot of people don't want black Americans to have money in their hand. They really just have a problem with it. They just have a real problem with it. But what do you get? We can't undo slavery. We can't undo the atrocities of slavery. You want to give us a bunch of scholarships? We don't want that. You know what we want? We want money. And so remedies, compensatory damages. Plaintiffs seek compensatory damages for economic and non-economic harm sought. Economic harms, that would be the land that we would have had over in Benin and Congo and these other countries. That would have been the money the labor that we were forced to endure and uncompensated. Look, all of these people who are participated in slavery, whether they sold us from the African continent or bought us here, they're all liable in solito, which means together. And so whether or not you get this one to pay you or that one to pay you, if the African countries have a problem with it, you know what? They can go sue some of these people in America or some British shipping company if they want to. But we're going to sue them. And we're going to let them do all the heavy lifting. Since since they had country-to-country treaties, you sue the person who you participated with. We as individuals, descendants, shouldn't have to do that. We're going to sue you because it's one of you as opposed to thousands of defendants. We're going to sue that one defendant. And then if he wants to try to sort out who's at fault, fine. Now, there's also a section in here for punitive damages, where applicable punitive damages may be awarded in cases of egregious conduct to deter similar future actions. So here's the thing. When I look at the captain's log in the Clotilda incident, when the captain arrived to Benin, he said there were 4,000 slaves there waiting to be sold to market. So even though the international slave trade had ended over 50 years before, it was still active. So even though we know about the Clotilda and we know about the Wanderer, there were probably hundreds, if not thousands, of other ships that brought Africans to the United States illegally. And so that's the research. That's research. And for those who participated and it was egregious, I mean, they had envoys come down from some of these European countries, especially the UK, England, trying to convince specifically the king of Dahomey to cut the slavery out. He wouldn't. So his actions were egregious, in my opinion. And so he may be subject to, that country may be subject to punitive damages. I get it. I know the Africans, y'all gonna hate this. And I know you back to Africa, Pan-Africans, I know you're gonna hate this too. But at the end of the day, most of the 40-something million Africans here in America want to stay here. We've been here for hundreds of years. We want to stay here. We're not going back to Africa. We may go visit. You all have made that impossible nearly. You know, you've made it nearly impossible for us to come and stay if we wanted to stay, so we're just going to stay here. The least you could do is compensate us for what we lost. We lost the access to the land. Many of the Africans had villages. Many of them had land. They had land titles, if that's what you want to call it, for lack of a better word. And so, you know, even if not, we had use of it. And there's compensation for that. The last few parts are implementation of enforcement, and basically it says that an interagency task force shall be established to facilitate and implement this act involving the Department of Justice. This is standard language. And we expect cooperation from these African countries to recognize the enforcement of these judgments. Any part of this is found unconstitutional, it'll be deemed unconstitutional, but the rest will be fine. And the actions shall take effect immediately. And so, again, just to highlight some of this particular act, or this type of act, takes into account a lot of my interactions with African Americans and Africans and people who I've spoken about since I took this project up back in 2021. Those of you guys will recall my series about Africans and their participation in the slave trade. And I took that very seriously. I thought it was shocking. Truthfully speaking, I did not know that Africans participated so heavily in the slave trade, and it was shocking, and it was egregious. You know, we tend to romanticize Africa. We tend to hold Africa harmless. But the truth is they were active participants. The African nations and the countries and the countrymen were active participants in the slave trade. And they are the reason that we are here, because Europeans were not walking, running, and hunting Africans down in the interior of Africa. People were literally marched hundreds of miles from the interior of Africa in neighboring nations and countries and brought to the shore to be sold to the Europeans. But for the Africans, slavery would have ended a long time ago because it would have been impossible. It would have been an impossible feat to undergo. So whether you romanticize Africa or not, understand that there's a debt. Whether you have an affinity or love for Africa or not, recognize that there's a debt that needs to be paid to foundational Black Americans. Whether you like it or not, there's a debt that needs to be paid. You can call it karma, you can call it IOU, whatever. But there's a debt that needs to be paid to foundational Black Americans. It's not something that we are supposed to get for free, because when you sold us, and I'm talking to the African brothers and sisters, when your kings and queens sold us into slavery, you were able to take control of the land that we had. You were able to take control of the resources that are beneath that land. And you still benefit from what's ours. You don't know what would have happened had we been there. We could have benefited. Our ancestors who were sold into slavery would have benefited from that oil and the resources in the land. But now, by selling us and getting rid of us and sending us over here and having us work for free, you benefited from that. And then on top of that, knowing the plight that we undergone, you didn't bother to come get us. So again, all the issues are addressed. And the bottom line is, for the y'all who I've explained to you that these African sovereigns, whether they existed or not, they're responsible. The predecessors or the successors are responsible for their predecessors. That's basic law of corporations. So that answers that question. So I don't want anybody who watches this video, anybody, well, they didn't exist at that, those countries don't want to hear that. That just means you're stupid, because I've read it 4 or 5 times. I don't want to hear that those nations didn't exist at that time. That means you're stupid. So anybody who says that the nations didn't exist at that time, we can't sue them, you're stupid. You shouldn't watch this video, okay? I'd hate to be so harsh, all right? Who is this open to? It is open to foundational Black Americans who can specifically trace their history or their lineage to Africans who were sold into slavery from Africa and brought to this country between 1808, after the international slave trade became illegal, and what? And brought to this country. Now there is a line in here, and I don't see it in this particular draft, but oftentimes they would make incidental stops from Africa. They might stop in Bermuda. They might stop in Jamaica, not to do slave trade, but to get supply. We also account for that in this statute. So just because, see, a lot of people will argue me to death about this. You don't like it. There's a no. There's a whole bunch of people who go, oh, it can't happen. No, I don't care what you think. It's going to happen anyway. If we could get Congress to enact this and the president to sign this, it's done. What are you going to do then? It's nothing. Nothing you can do about it. It's just that simple. It is this piece of paper with the president's signature on it and ratified by both houses of Congress, and it's a done deal. Now, let me tell you something. The biggest adversity that folks who sought reparations have faced has been the idea that we would allow Black Americans to sue American-based corporations, families, individuals in the government, in American courts, to take money from Americans to give it to other Americans. Fundamentally, people have a problem with that because they just have a problem with the redistribution of wealth in that regard. They just have a problem with it, especially considering that slavery was legal at that time. But I can promise you that those people should not have a problem with Black Americans, foundational Black Americans, suing these African sovereigns. Why? They don't have any skin in the game. Why would they care if some Black people in America sued some Black people over, or some Black countries or African countries in Africa, to bring resources here to the United States? Only a fool would have a problem with that if you're an American? You mean we're going to sue these out? We're going to have our foundational black Americans who are based in Georgia and Alabama, Mississippi, Texas, Arkansas. They're going to have an opportunity to sue these African nations, these burgeoning countries, and get a stake in their oil and resources and minerals and land that we may be able to purchase or whatever, or get money from them in exchange for their rights. We can pay them money directly. Where's the law in it for America? Why would, and if we just want to do it on a racial matter, why would white folks care what black folks do with other black folks? I can get why they wouldn't want you suing these white corporations and country and families, but they don't care about us suing. I mean, I'm gonna tell you, the African nations are gonna have very little support here in the United States. The jury is gonna be American, the judge is gonna be American, and the law is gonna be American, and they were clearly wrong. And they haven't been held to task for their participation in the slave trade. If they don't like it, they can file a cross claim against whatever defendant they feel is necessary, and they can deal with that. But as far as black Americans, we will be made whole. And let the defendants sort it out. Some of you are saying, well, why do they deserve money? Well, those African nations receive money for our sale. They receive something of value. So why shouldn't we receive something of value for reparations? Why is it that we have to take scholarships? Why don't you give us our money? Give us our gold. Give us our diamonds. We'll take oil. We'll take minerals. We'll take mineral rights. But the African Americans in this country are owed something, and we're tired of asking for it. We had the year of no return, and some of us went, some of us didn't. But still, you haven't opened up your doors and allowed us to re-enter Africa as easily as you put us out or sold us away. So that lets us know. You saw what we were going through in the 1950s. You didn't come save us then. Being beaten and water holes, our women being attacked by German shepherds. You didn't come save us then. You haven't extended an olive branch other than to say, I'm sorry. And we thank you for your sorry. But you still owe us some money. You still owe us reparations for what you did. Because at the end of the day, the biggest beneficiary of the sale of Africans from Africa have been those other Africans who remained on the land and were able to take our resources in the form of the land that we were living on and using and utilizing. You did that. And you don't have to like it. But, you can still be our brother, but you have to pay us what you owe us. And this type of legislation, along with some lawsuits, will help us get that done. And so we as African Americans can finally begin to address the issue of reparations. We can finally put that to rest. Now, this doesn't address all of the African Americans or foundational black Americans who were enslaved in America, but this is a start. It's a start that sets a precedent. It creates law. It creates a body of law. It will create legislation, and we can build from there. It's a toehold in a mountain that you need to climb. But if put in effect, it will have an immediate effect and will cause a ripple effect. And I think it's good legislation. It's constitutionally sound. It's based on legislation that's been enacted already. Specifically, I'm looking at the act that grants 9/11 victims the opportunity to sue Saudi Arabia, which is a sovereign nation, for the acts of the individuals in their country, i.e. Osama bin Laden and his crew, for what they did in 9/11. This act it takes tenets from that. So it has been done before. This is not something that's unheard of. So I hope you all listen to this video before you just look at the title, because I'm going to clown you in the comment section. But shout out to all my brothers and sisters. I've been dealing with this for about 3 or 4 years. Do your research. But yeah, foundational black American slave trade redress